To set up our circuit board for a LogoMouse, the first thing we're going to need is the printed circuit board. In addition to that, you're going to need a push button, the one I have here. You will need either an XH style or a PH style connector. Either one of these will work. You will need a sliding switch. So here I have a bigger sliding switch and a small sliding switch. Again, either one of these will work. You will need a voltage regulator, and ideally you'll be using a 6-volt regulator because that's the greatest amount of voltage the motors can handle. I can't get it to where you can make out the writing on that voltage regulator, but just know it's a 6-volt regulator. You're going to need a diode. Here I have a diode that's capable of handling, I believe, 2 amps. And you're going to need some male headers here. I have one set of 3. I have another set right here that we're going to eventually cut down to look like that. And then you're going to need some female headers. I have a long stick here that again we'll cut down to fit our project. So the first thing we're going to need to do is, or we're going to want to do, is take our circuit board, and you can see right here and here there are some little tabs that are left over from the fabrication process. You can just take a pair of needle nose pliers, or any kind of pliers really, and just snap those off, or you can try to snap them off. It's a little bit challenging there, but got that one, and get that other one right there. Now you don't need to do that, it just makes it look a little bit nicer. This next part you don't need to do as well, but again it just makes it look nicer. I'm going to take a little piece of sandpaper and I'm going to brush that circuit board right on top of that so that it's nice and flat right there. So you can see it's kind of, we got some jagged pieces right here, but over here it's a little bit smoother. Once the edge of your circuit board looks nice, it's time to go ahead and start soldering components to it. We're going to start with the push button here, and so to get started, flip your circuit board over and then take your flux pen and just dab the 2 spots where you need to solder. Dab right there, and I'm going to dab right there, and then I'm going to put a little tiny bit on the leads coming off the button here, so just like that. This is where the solder is going to go, so that's where I need to paint it. Once you've done that, make sure you flip it so that you're looking down from the top side, the side where there's a circle drawn on the circuit board, and then feed the leads for the button into the holes for the button. And we could tape this down, but we actually don't need to. There's an easy way to do this. I can just bend the leads for the button, and that'll actually hold it in place. So if I look at it here, you can see how I've bent it, and then I can also just push it down when I'm soldering. You do want to make sure that it's that there's no gap between the button and the board when you solder it down. That'll help to make sure it doesn't come loose eventually. Once you've done all that, go ahead and tin your soldering iron. Put a little bit of solder on the end and dip it in your brill, spin it around a little bit, and then put just a little bit on the tip and feed in some solder from the other side here. Putting just a little tiny bit on the tip before you try to feed solder into it helps the transfer of the heat. That little blob right there allows you to make sure that the tip is touching both the pad and the wire. So now let's see how I did. If I look at my soldering joints, there's definitely solder connecting the circle, the pad, to the lead of the button. So once you're done with that, take some flush cutters and clip off the leads. Don't clip it perfectly flush with the board. Leave just a little bit behind. Otherwise you might rip that pad off the board. So that's our first component right there. The next component I want to solder is the diode. Again, I want to start with the easy components so that I get some practice. If this were my first time soldering, I would want to make sure that I was doing the easy things first so that by the time I get to the hard stuff, I have a little bit more skill. The diode here needs to be bent so that you get a 90-degree angle on each side. Once you've bent it like so, then feed the leads through the holes. It's important that the diode is lined up as shown on the circuit board. So if you look, there's a little tiny bit of gray at the end of the diagram right here. That matches the little tiny bit of gray actually on the diode. I'm going to go ahead and slide it down so the camera can focus on it. And hopefully you can see there's just a little band of gray on that diode. I'm going to try and focus here so you can see it well. There you go. If that's put in incorrectly, you'll have to take it out and redo it because that forces the flow of the that only allows electricity to flow one way. It's included on this circuit board as a sort of protection mechanism. The next thing I'm going to do is flip it over, and I'm going to pull on the lead and bend it a little bit. I'm going to do that to both of them. And I'm going to take a little bit of flux and I'm going to dab it right on that pad. The flux helps to clean the pad and the wire when you're soldering. It helps make all of your soldering connections go just a little bit better. So now that I've done all of that, I am going to put again just a little bit of solder on the tip of my iron and clean it again. And then I'm going to put just a little bit on the end and heat. I'm touching both the circle and the lead. And then I feed a little bit of solder in there. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I get a little bit more on the end. And then just feed that solder right in there. And it should just flow onto both the pad and the lead if you're heating them both up. Now that I'm done with that, I am going to clip that lead and clip this lead. The next easiest thing to do is the sliding switch. So I've got my switch here ready to put in, and it actually doesn't matter with the switch whether I put it in this way or if I flip it around and put it in that way. Either way, it'll work the same. So I'm going to put it in here. Actually, before I put it in, I am going to flip it over here and put a little bit of flux on those pads before I put the switch in. And then I can actually put a little bit on these leads as well. Flip it over and get the other ones. And then I'm going to put it in those holes. And if I flip it over, it's going to be hard to keep it on the board. So I have a trick here that I'm going to use, and that is I'm going to put a little tape on it to hold it down. So I've got some masking tape here, and I'm just putting enough to keep it from falling out. Doesn't need to be super tight, but I do need to make sure that there's no gap between the board and the switch. That looks pretty good right there. So now that that's done, I'm going to solder those connections. Again, I am putting a little bit of solder on the tip of my iron and cleaning it before I do every single connection here. It keeps the tip of the iron working nice during the entire process here. There we go. Get the next one. It's hard to see in the camera, but at first when I feed solder, and sometimes it actually doesn't flow onto the pad, but then once I give it a second, that pad heats up and then it flows right onto the pad. Okay, so now all of those look like nice little Hershey Kisses. Well, not so much the last one. I think I'm going to put just a little bit more solder on that last one. There we go. And now when I look at it, it looks like a nice little Hershey's Kiss. It's about as good a focus as I can get it for you. I'm going to take my flush cutters and I'm going to clip those off. And again, it's not perfectly flush, it's just close. I can take my tape off. Before I solder my male headers into place, I need to cut them to length. So right here, I'm going to cut so that I have 3 male headers on one side, and I'm going to hold it like this so that when I cut it, they don't shoot across the room or anything. So there we go, I got that one cut. And as you saw before, I already had another one, so I'm not going to cut the last one. Just need 2 of them. Now it's time to get the female headers here. So I have one female header already cut to fit into D5 here. So that's the section that the servo motor that's connected to D5 will connect to. I'm going to use this female header to actually hold it in place. If I were to try to hold that with my bare hand, it would burn me. But if I hold it like this, it holds everything in place and it makes it really easy to solder. Again, before I solder, I am going to put a little bit of flux on those pads and a few on the pins here, or a little bit on the pins here. And then this part's a little bit tricky. I want to try and hold it perpendicular when I do it. I'm going to pull it out of the female header so that I can show you exactly what I mean. If I solder this, I want to make sure that it's not angled one way or angled the other. I don't want it to be angled one way or the other. I want it to be straight up and down. So I'm going to hold it that way, and I don't think I'm going to have trouble doing it. It's just something that I need to pay attention to when I'm soldering. Now that I have my board ready, I am going to again put a little bit of solder on the tip, clean it, and then I'm going to just make sure it's on there as good as I can get it before I start soldering. And I'm going to go for this one over here first because that's where it's trying to pop up right now. Fed a little bit of solder in there. And I'm actually going to hold it until it cools off. And once it cools off, then I'm going to take a quick look at it and make sure that it's right where I want it and that it's perpendicular. And if I look, I'm going to pull again, the female header off so that you guys can see. It looks like it's nice and perpendicular. I'm going to get it to where it's focused there for you, or try to. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and put the female header back in place so that it holds those other pins when I solder. If I don't do that, then sometimes what happens is those other pins get out of place and actually melt the little piece of plastic that holds them all together. This really helps to keep everything lined up when you're soldering. I think I got a little too much on this pin right here, so I'm going to just take a little bit off. And now I'm going to look at it again. And it looks nice and perpendicular. I think I did a decent job. So they're sticking out a little bit more than I'd like. So I'm going to use my flush cutters to trim them up. This should be done over a trash can. I'm doing it here so that you can see what I'm doing. But sometimes these things shoot off like little bullets and you don't want them hitting somebody in the eye. To get the second header put in place for D6, take one of the male headers you have and put it in place. Again, before you do so, put a little flux on those pads and even on the pins there. And do it just like you did the last one. Go ahead and check your work. Looks okay. Use your flush cutters to cut those so that it doesn't look too long. Again, you should be doing it over a trash can, facing down into the trash can so that you don't hurt anybody. And we're done with male headers for now. This third row for D11, we actually don't need those. That's sort of for an advanced thing. The next thing we're going to do is put on our female headers. So here is my female header, and it needs to be cut down so that it actually fits right in here, just like that. So I have it fit in place, and I can see the hole where it's too long is right there. So that pin, I'm actually going to want to pull that pin out. So it's this pin right here. Now if I pull it out, I'm going to test it again just to make sure it's the right length. And you can see it fits in there just perfect. Every single pad has a pin going through it. So I didn't pull the wrong pin. You want to really make sure you get the right length before you pull that pin. Next, I'm going to take my flush cutters and I'm going to cut right on that spot where we pulled the pin. And then I'm going to try and trim up the edge here so you can see the edge is a little bit messed up. If I take my flush cutters and I just kind of carefully trim it up, I can get most of it to look fairly nice. Oh, be careful not to cut parts of the headers away that you actually need. And if you're having trouble with the flush cutters, the other trick you can do is use a little bit of sandpaper. That's actually my preferred method for doing this. You just take it and rub it on there just a little bit. If you do too much, you actually sand through the plastic housing here right into the wire, the metal that's inside of it. You don't want to do that. So I'm going to just do a little bit more. And that looks pretty good there. I'm going to focus it so you can see a little better. And to round it off so that it looks nice. I'm just going to do that. That should be good. So now we want to do the exact same thing again because the Arduino Nano is the exact same number of pins on each side. So here I have right there is where I want to pull my next pin to get them the exact same length. Once you have both of your female headers cut to length and ready to put into your circuit board, it's time to take your Arduino Nano and actually plug that into the headers. What this will do is it will help us keep them lined up and square to the board when we're soldering. So I've got both of them plugged into my Arduino Nano. There we go. And then before I put that together, I'm going to put a nice strip of flux along this entire length here, and that one as well. And then I'm going to put a little bit on each one of those leads there, on each one of those pins. Just a little bit is all you need. One pass is all that it takes. Once you've done that, go ahead and put your headers into your board just like that. When you flip it over, you'll notice that, so you can see how it's holding everything perpendicular to each other. If I only put in one at a time, there's a good chance it would be at a slight angle. Now this is when you get to be good at soldering. When you have to solder a bunch of pins. So just like I've always done, I'm going to put a little bit on the tip of my iron and clean it again. Just go pin by pin. Once you're done, your pins should look something like that. Check to make sure that none of them there's no solder bridge linking any pins together, and that the solder actually attaches the pin to the pad, that the pad is actually completely covered by solder. Once you're done with that, you can take your Arduino Nano off of your circuit board, and you're going to want to do it carefully. Grab it by the circuit board, by the fiberglass portion of the circuit board right here and right here. Do not put any pressure on this metal USB connector. So you're going to pry up just a little bit on each side. And after you pry just a little bit, kind of work it back and forth. So I'll do that again sideways. So if I have it in here, I'm grabbing it not on the metal part, but on the fiberglass part, and just work it back and forth slowly. You should be able to get that Arduino Nano out of there without bending any pins. You're going to have to do it really slowly and carefully. The next step is adding the JST connector here. I'm using a pH style connector just because that's what I have on hand, and it actually fits the circuit board fairly well, a little bit better than an XH style. I'm going to twist it a little bit so that it leaves a little bit of room for the sensors down the road. It'll be hard to see well at this point, but you'll see in just a minute after we get done soldering it what I'm talking about. So now that it's in place, I'm going to take a little bit of flux and dab each pin and pad here. And then just solder it like I have been. Pull off my tape. And I'm going to cut those leads so they're just a little bit shorter than the ones that are holding my female headers in. Again, you should be doing that over a trash can. So that's what it looks like, and you can see how it's got a slight angle to it. It's pointing this way just a little bit to give a little bit of room to where we're eventually going to connect some sensors. The last piece we need to connect for right now is the voltage regulator, and it's a bit tricky. That's why I saved it for the very last. So the way the voltage regulator works is we plug it in here, and it's not going to push down all the way. It's got a few things here that keep it from getting super close to the circuit board, and I think that's because they don't want it getting the circuit board really hot. But we're going to put a little bit of flux here, 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 and on the back side as well. And then we're going to flip the circuit board over and get these pads really well here. The voltage regulator must be plugged in correctly. So if we look at the diagram here, you can see how there's a sort of a metal piece in the background or a gray piece in the background. Well, the gray part needs to be in the background here too. So this thing needs to be on this side. I'm going to push it down, and I'm going to do my best to hold it perpendicular when I solder. I'm going to solder the two outside pads first, and there's a good reason for that. The outside pads are going to solder relatively easy. The solder will just flow right onto them. The middle pad is a little bit trickier. The middle pin right here is connected to this gigantic piece of metal right here. And so it's actually a heat sink. When we heat it up with the soldering iron is not, it's going to take a long time for it to get hot. So I save it for the last. That way, if it's not going well, it's a lot easier to deal with. Everything else is sort of holding this in place, and I just keep on letting the heat flow until eventually it flows on that pad. You can see it took a lot longer for that metal to melt. If I were to touch this with my hand right now, let me see here how hot that is. Yeah, I can feel it. If I were to hold my finger there, it would burn my finger. So, once you've got that, it's time to trim those leads. And be careful you don't bend your voltage regulator here just like I did. I'm going to straighten it back out. It can't be bent too many times or else it'll break off. Okay, this is what our circuit board should look like now. It has everything on it that we need in order to complete the movement lessons. Be sure not to throw away the remaining portion of your female header here. We're actually going to need this to connect the Bluetooth module to your circuit board. So go ahead and put it in your parts bag for now.